Daylen, thanks for coming on.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right, so yeah, I kind of give a little brief overview where I'm coming from. So I, okay, so I basically, well, in high school and actually, if I go back a little bit further,
Hmm.
and before college, I was never really in academics. I wasn't really very intellectual. It was really just like 6 months before college that I kind of realized that, oh, I kind of want to learn everything about everything. And I just had I think I was kind of like pre-planning that for a while. But before that, I was into like partying and drugs and like video games and stuff like that, which I think is pretty normal. But I kind of realized that that was kind of a dead end, and it was that all there was going to be to life, was just going to be a hedonic cycle of like accruing things and like consuming things and whatnot. So I kind of became disillusioned with like kind of the vibes of like American in particular, like consumerism, and just like getting better jobs and like making more money in order to buy new things that you put in a house that just like clutters up. It doesn't provide any inherent meaning. And I knew that I needed to know more about the world though. And so I kind of looked at like the big overview of like all of the different like subjects in science and history and philosophy and all these things. And I kind of realized that it would be probably it would be pretty efficient if I could learn like physics and mathematics and kind of the low memory subjects like initially, and then I could kind of branch out into other subjects like history and biology and whatnot that have more memory to them.
Hmm.
Because if you were to basically look at like everything we know about biology, it's very memory intensive. And
Right.
if you don't know too much initially, then it's going to be hard to select what details or facts you should be paying attention to at any given point. So if you start with like physics, which is very low memory, and mathematics, which is kind of like the structuring of like theorems and like how you count, and how you abstract away from counting things,
Hmm.
then from there it might allow you to select better what facts you attend to in these broader disciplines that are harder to get a grasp of. And so I did that for a while, where I studied like that kind of stuff, like math, physics, computer science, and that kind of thing. And then at the same time, I was kind of had this other spear or whatever in my mind that had to do with like a Renaissance ideal of trying to doing many things. It's kind of like a diversified strategy to life.
Hmm.
Like you should be able to fix things. You should be able to make art. You should be able to think like a philosopher. You should be able to have good conversations with people. You should be able to manage your own finances. You should be able to like solve practical problems, this kind of thing.
Hmm.
And like these two just kind of got closer to each other over time, in the sense that like they felt like they weren't that far from each other in my own mind. And so I could kind of like use like the very rigorous like mathematical, like philosophical ways of thinking in order to basically say what I should be doing as a Renaissance idealist, and use the Renaissance ideal to basically kind of soften my approach to math and like hard sciences and whatnot. And as this started to happen too, it started to inevitably kind of enter the grayish zones of psychology and sociology. And I realized that, well, in some sense, like we have like these models of personality, which are like differences in like agents from like the big five and whatnot. But that's just
Hmm.
like a factor analysis on top of questions and answers.
Right.
And I felt like there was something deeper. And at the same time, I realized that it was super essential to have a model of differences between agents
Hmm.
that are somewhat invariant across time, in order to figure out or to kind of contextualize the variances between or within an individual across time. Like the invariance always kind of comes along with variance. Um, and so I kind of started to get this idea, and more recently, especially by through like just kind of understanding assembly theory more, which is kind of becoming more of a thing, and also like statistical mechanics and whatnot. That time, like if I'm going to have a metaphysics, I'm probably not going to make consciousness fundamental. I'm probably not going to make causality fundamental. In space, you can kind of make fundamental in the sense that you start with like a graph. But I felt like time was really the thing that needed to be fundamental, in the sense that all of these other things like causality, consciousness, and space or whatever can be thought to be a priori to the idea that time has passed. And if time has passed, then there's this interesting notion in that, well, if time passes, like space opens up. And as space opens up, then you can associate with that space a graph where you have like nodes and connections between them. And that can give you an idea of like some kind of emergent causality. And at the same time, like that kind of gives rise to like consciousness. But, and again, I can kind of see it going both ways, in that consciousness is just always there. But then that kind of leads me back to time. Well, if time has passed, then there seems to be this idea that I go to sleep every day, and that just going to sleep is kind of like unconsciousness. And so if I'm kind of alternating between consciousness and unconsciousness, then maybe I should make just purely consciousness fundamental, and maybe I should have like this alternating period in which space, in some sense, like during the nights or whatever, it can be either like non-existent, or it could be like all-encompassing, in which space is just like all there is. It's just this vast openness, which is kind of what it feels like too if you go into like deep meditative states that kind of approach like an unconscious state where you're still kind of there. You still have this I amness. And then I realized that, okay, well, if I have time and time has passed, and sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's unconscious, but sometimes I open up a space and I figure out a causal connection that will then persist across these cycles of unconsciousness and consciousness. And so there's an intermediate sandwiched layer in between, which I just call subconsciousness. And then if I'm in my grossly like woken, like conscious state or whatever, then like things will seem to be apparent. Like there'll be things about the graph of like space that emerges that will seem to be more apparent at different times. And I will know from experience that sometimes there are subtleties within the graph that I'm not yet paying attention to, that might disillude me with the causal structure I'm drawing. And so this is kind of how like where I initially started to like base my model of like personality or consciousness on. Like personality is intertwined with development in my model. Like they're kind of inseparable in some sense. Like one is just like basically looking at the different ways in which you can be, and then one's looking at the becoming axes of like what do you become as you be these certain states, well. And so that kind of lead me to like basically kind of extend onto Jung's work. And maybe I'm going a little bit, giving too much detail now. Maybe I should kind of stop at that.
We'll break it down. We'll look at this.
Yeah, we could I just don't want to give too much detail at first, because I feel like we could definitely expand onto this kind of stuff, and have like a whole conversation about it, and maybe we should link it up with other things potentially.
Yeah.
Or like we can go a number of different directions here.
Well, first of all, I want to say it's extraordinary that we're not talking about the current news. We're not talking about, even in your story, you reference this idea of maybe decelerationism isn't the right word, but you were looking for bigger frequencies, right? Than just the party, get on drugs, play video games, maybe do some schooling, maybe do some of the things that the world wants you to do, but at their rate and at their pace, right? And I'm using there very, very loosely. It is a collective creation. There's Very few people, if any, that just straight up control everything. But anyway, you're telling a story of decelerationism from my point of view. Of, okay, what are the deeper frequencies that we engage with, and looking for those. And I think kind of the point that you're making, or at least the way that I would view it, is the deeper you go, the more you get to a frequency of life where it's hard to distinguish separations, right? Where you get deep enough with time, you start getting deep with consciousness, which means you must get deep with choice, which means you must get deep with existence and light, and that's what I would call the frequency of reality, and the frequency of life is when you get to those deeper and deeper frequencies. But I really love your story. First of all, you're not just going off about the current events and the current news, and even in your story you're mentioning how you've been looking for a deeper and more profound frequency. And I think once you get low enough, you start finding the frequency of life, not just in like a vague sense, but it's a frequency that we vibrate at, for lack of a better word, because it's not a two-dimensional frequency. It's not even a three-dimensional frequency. It's a many dimensional frequency. And I also like this story that you tell of interdisciplinary searching. You know, you're looking for more, and I think that's really important. Especially as we Veristruct, to look for more, look for the interdisciplinary, look for the frequencies that bind everything together. And then I really love what you're talking about now, which is, okay, now you're getting to this point of, what if personality is a thing, yes, but we self-select, right? We choose what answers to put to questions. And why do we do that? Is that a response to what we're capable of? And is that response important for the whole? And I think you and I are on the same page that yes, that's important for the whole. And so to some degree, I wouldn't necessarily say it was a bad thing that you were being hedonistic and being on drugs and partying while you were in college. Do I think that was a sustainable model of living? No. And do I think your pursuit for deeper frequencies is a good one? Yes. But it's amazing how all stories meet at the unity of reality. You can what I like to call, you can be a rock dropping in the ocean, but the ocean currents are still going to push that rock in a particular direction. You can't just drop to the bottom of the ocean. It's going to push you. So even as you think you're being as selfish or as individual as you possibly can be, there's still a collective involved there. There's still a function that you perform. And that's why I would say ultimately the most important thing is not consciousness, and to some degree not even time. It's just that you exist in the first place. The fact that we exist and we can make choices at all, whether they're, preset or not, whether they're determined or not, we still have at least the illusion of choice, and that's amazing in of itself. And the fact that we exist at all is the purpose of life. That's the whole reason. That's the whole thing. So if you're sitting there and you're being like, oh, I'm not having a good time, or I want to have a better time, you should give yourself a better time. You exist. That's all the good that anyone ever needs to do, is to be. And to some degree, if we could scale people back from this society that's so decelerationist, and that serves a function as well, serves an important function as well. But when we start scaling back our speed, we might just find that that, oh, I didn't need to do all those things. I didn't need to do all this. I could have done less. I could have accepted myself more. I didn't have to reject myself so much. Which gets me to this idea that you brought up of dreams, right? Of dreaming and of the unconscious of sleep. Speaking of which, lately I've been having more dreams. Now it's probably because I'm getting more sleep deprived, but got a new baby at home, so that's bound to happen. But I firmly believe that we are processing interdimensional reality in our dreams through our emotions, and it's important to say through, not in them. That seems to be one of the most important things of life is flow, right? It's flow. Keep going, keep moving, keep operating, right? Because if you get stuck on something, it's almost like you're getting stuck on a choice as opposed to the fact that you can choose. Between those two, which is the better? The better is the fact that you can choose in the first place, not one choice in of itself. But that seems to be what we're doing when we don't flow. We're choosing a choice. We're saying a choice is more important than to continue to make choices, to continue to have the power to choose, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so that aligns pretty well. I would make a couple of things that I would like to clarify. Those I feel like you can have it go one of two ways. You can either say that selection or choice comes first, and then like time comes after, in the sense that you can make choices across time. But you can also say, well, time has passed, and from that there is a graph of two different choices that you could make, and then you can choose one after time has passed. And I think either way is fine. I think that they're kind of inverted from each other. But then I would also say, in the sense that unconsciousness or like deep sleep, no choices can be made, and that you can't actually in deep consciousness, you can't make an error, in that you make a choice and then you later regret that choice. It's literally just, there's nothing there. It's just vastness.
I regret many things I choose in my sleep.
No, that's dreaming sleep, though. That's a form of the subconscious.
Right.
And so you can have this, you don't really have this sense of I amness. It's kind of like the subject and the object have kind of blurred in a way, but your default mode network isn't really online. So your sense of identity and instrumentation isn't really there. So everything goes and everything is fine. You can have different kind of physics in the dream realm, which is kind of interesting. There's also something called lucid dreaming, where basically your default mode network in your waking life gets uploaded during a dream, and a lot of times this will derail the dream. You'll basically, because I've done it a couple of times, and then I just fly into the sky, and then eventually I just wake up. It's hard for me to just sustain that kind of thing. But I haven't really tried too hard, though. I don't even know how you would try at that, though. I guess you have a little journal. People say journals help, but I don't. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. You know what you said about flow? In my model, I also call it actuation. You can have a nested hierarchical or holarchical idea of actuation, but you can also have an absolute sense of actuation, where the past and the future kind of become what you're operating on, and the present is just what you're in some sense. And so time can be very different. It's not like you're when you are in flow, you're really engaged in a task or whatever. It's not like you're actually flowing literally through time, and that event A happens, right, and then B happens, C happens. It's kind of you're jumping in a way.
You're not a Newtonian object, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so actuation or flow, these periods of actuation or flow in my model, if I map it onto geometry and topology, these would be like points of actuators in which there is no personality per se, like because you're not you can't actually be typed when you're in these states, because in some sense you have to basically flow through time in a Newtonian way in order for typing to become a thing. But then in between these vast get areas of openness between actuation, you will tend to have a certain linear narrative, and then that will create a conscious reality in which you have a subconscious shadow. And then once you have that kind of duality of like, this is real, this isn't actually real, this is an illusion or whatever, then you can be typed by looking at the characteristics of what you think is the most real thing, basically, and what you're not paying attention to that seems to be real when you're in a different personality. And so and so like for instance, so basically we have like these like functions. And so if I look at it, so like I have like a micro level, and then like an intermediate like mesio level, and then a macro level.
The mesio level, you're talking about subconscious?
No, so this is a different kind of thing. So like the mesio, actually you are right in some sense, because like the mesio level is when like the consciousness and the subconsciousness are on equal footing, and they create each other. You can have an idea of like basically at the very micro level, that kind of thing kind of disappears, and then at the very macro level that kind of thing disappears as well. But in between, they kind of exist on equal footing, and they create each other. They write each other into existence. And so at like the micro level, which is kind of centered around an agent, like, so basically we haven't really introduced an ontology yet, but we can have a simple ontology of there are human agents, and then there are small world networks, like kind of like this, where every agent has access to every other agent. Or like maybe you could have like this in physical space or digital space, where like basically you have.
But
like
you're talking about an agent, as in the. Yeah, this is where it gets complicated. So the perceptual being, essentially, right?
Yeah,
the being
so like,
perceived.
Well, okay, so like I think of it like an agent. I mean, you could have a lot of different kinds of agents, but like basically, we generally all can agree that like humans are agents, in the sense that we assume that they make choices, essentially, that they have access to being able to have causal, like have an idea of causal structure in their mind, and they can communicate that. And so like that would be kind of like an agent, but as human agents, we all come in communities. Like there was never a time where we just had like single individual humans that just like made all their choices like in isolation from a community. And so that at the micro level, like, or the human agent level, like that obviously is a very important level, and that's where like functional typing comes in, and that will extend off Jung. I'll talk about that later. But then you have like the mesio level, which is somewhere in between these small world networks, where we can come around in the town square, for instance, or we can like interact on Twitter, where everyone can basically reach everyone else, and there isn't like an indirect thing we have to go through in order to find people. And then you have the large world networks, and these are like basically the areas of society that, like, if you want to try to find someone with a particular idea or whatever, you kind of have to go door to door or book to book. Like, it's very hard to kind of search around. You can ask other people, like, hey, do you know someone who's kind of talking like this, or do you know someone that is like that has like is embodying this kind of lifestyle or whatever? And it might be hard to get there. And so you have these large world networks, and then the macro is like beyond that. It's like beyond like these kind of large world networks. But you have like these large world, small world, and then individual human agents. And from here, like, you can have like a functional typing here, and then these functions can be abstracted into quadras, and that's too much detail for now. But then these quadras can be abstracted into paradigms. But if we kind of go back and keep it simple for now, and just say that we're talking about just like human agents, we're talking, and you can assume that you're a human agent if you want, but you don't have to assume that. But you can.
But we're
You
not
can.
talking about the holistic being that's interdimensional, right? We're talking about the perceived being, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I'll go along with that. It's like basically
Because
you can
for me,
assume that.
the argument
Yeah.
that I would the point that I would make, and I think Verestruck seems to make, is that when you're talking about the conscious and unconscious meeting in a subconscious sort of setting, that's internal. Yes, it's external, but like you said, it creates both at the same time. That at the truly macro level, micro level, not in the terms of the hierarchy that you just labeled, but I would agree that at the macro level and the micro level, they don't exist. But at the middle level, they exist. And that middle level is not just external, it's not just internal. It's both at the same time, which is really interesting that it works that way. And I think the reason why it works that way is so the thing that I talk about often is that we are folds upon folds upon folds. And I don't know whether if you had infinite dimensions and then you were to derive or to fold an infinite being until it became finite in a lower dimension, that would then give that being choice. I don't know if that's the case, or whether choice is something even beyond that. But that's where the power comes from, right? The power is the infinite also being finite at the same time. That you're both at the same time. That any living being is both an infinite being and a finite being, and that gives you a tremendous amount of power. But it's not power that is conscious. It's not conscious power. That's what's interesting about it. Now, is it unconscious power? Maybe. I think I would actually argue for that it is unconscious power that can be made conscious, but that the conscious is hardly guaranteed. That is essentially what we're trying to do in this life, is trying to make as much unconscious conscious as possible. And we do that through accepting the whole being, right? It's not going, oh, this being is being silly, it's giving me crazy dreams, or it's giving me cancer, or it's giving me all sorts of different things. It's like, no, it's trying to tell you something about the infinite being that's in the other dimensions, if you would listen. And I think the thing that really struck this home for me, this idea of the infinite being also being the finite being at the same time, is I saw a demonstration of what it would be like to have a two-dimensional object come into a one-dimensional plane. And essentially it was this. They just created a little slit. It's not a perfect one-dimensional, but you create a little slit. And then I'm a two-dimensional being here, and I just kind of pass this slit across, and you see little bands of light up. And if you were a one-dimensional being, it would make no sense. You'd be like, where is this coming from? Here's the kicker, though, is it still explains itself in the lower dimension. So if you want to, you can explain it away in the dimension you're in, and explain away higher dimensions. Just be like, there's no higher dimensions. There's no other dimensions. Higher, lower, doesn't matter. There's no other dimensions. It's perfectly explainable in this existence. And so we can go, oh yeah, carbon gets placed together and organizes itself into a body. That's explainable. The energy's all there. There's no unexplainable energy element to it. But you can't just grab all those materials, put them together, and have it be a human, right? We know all the materials, where they come from, the amount of energy required, but you put all that together, and you even give it as much time as you possibly can, and it won't form a person. Or if it does, it's because of something else, right? Of something greater than it. And so you can explain it using the any observable mechanics that you want to try and explain the being, and it will be true. And yet there's still an element that's unexplainable. Why aren't we just moving creatures, right? Where we just move objects to places and we just move ourselves to places? Why is it that we seem so fixated on these vaguer elements, right? We're so fixated, and that's the other thing I wanted to tell you about kind of your brief your brief intro. Lovely, by the way, but not brief. About your intro is that you immediately went into a kind of conscious mindset. Now you're using your consciousness to try and to explain more of the unconscious, which is what I'm trying to do too. I mean, I'm not any different in that way. I'm trying to explain the unconscious using my consciousness. But yeah, you jumped right into consciousness, and that's really interesting. That's really interesting. It's like, why are we using this power to then go back and try and explain the unconsciousness, right? That's really interesting. That makes no sense unless we're composed of more dimensions, especially since that seems to be an emotional sort of point of view. That's not necessarily something that that you can explain through outside forces, right? There's an emotionality, there's a intuition to some degree that calls people like me and you to go, hey, we got this great ability to understand mathematics and physics and Newtonian objects, and yet we seemed completely unconvinced that we are Newtonian objects. That there's more to the thing here, even if determinism is true, that everything's determined and our choices are just completely calculatable. For some reason, we still feel like there's more information. There's more to this. And so that's why I mentioned my dreams, because in my dreams lately, I've been processing a lot of emotion. And I've been processing a lot of emotion during the day, too. And that's why it's important to slow down and to think of the being as an infinite being, right? This changes so much. I had a conversation with someone recently where they're like, why is there suffering? And I'm like, if you're an infinite being, temporary suffering can be a wonderful thing, can be extremely productive. / doesn't exist, to some degree you can wish it away, you look at the world at the speed of a mountain, and and the death of humans means nothing to some degree to the mountain, right? So you can, with the right framework, with the right idea of what this is, you can give it all the power in the world, and you can give it no power at all, but you end up giving it something in between, right? And that's what I find so fascinating. So if I had to say what's going on here, you have an infinite being, right? Gets folded so many times until it's a finite being in some lower dimension, either one time or infinite times, doesn't really matter. It happens, right? And that infinite being is still there, and it's still infinite. That's what's so interesting. Just because you created our being into a finite being doesn't mean the infinite being doesn't still exist out there. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, why are we doing this? Because the finite being can make choices. That infinite being can't make any more choices. It's infinity in an infinite dimension. It can't make choices anymore. And so maybe the greatest choice we made of all was to be folded down into infinity so we could make more choices. And maybe that's the only choice that matters, because we're going to end up making choices. And that's beautiful in of itself. We've been given this, we've chosen to get a blank canvas, and technically if we do nothing with the blank canvas, we've already succeeded. We've already done what we're supposed to in this existence. But we're going to paint on it anyway, right? And how you paint is up to you. And so that's why you can say something like, all stories meet at the unity of reality, because we all had a blank canvas at some point, because we exist, and we all decided to paint on it. And ultimately the canvas was all that was needed to join us all together as one, right? And so paint all you want. You're gonna get what you're gonna get what comes to you, from that paint. But the real story of existence and of life was the blank canvas, not the paint.
Yeah, this resonates really well. I can kind of map it back into all of my theory, and I'll see if I do it in like an elegant and poetic way, like you can. But basically, like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You have this canvas to paint on, but if you don't paint on it, like, what's the point?
Right.
But if you do, you're going to fold yourself, and you're going to make yourself more like distanced from your infinite self. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of what leads into the theory of, okay, well, yeah, you hit right on the nail with the limitations of physics. And that in physics, we're looking externally at these external things, and basically we don't need to know any more than what's on the surface, because that contains all the information about the causal structure between the outside and the inside. Mm-hmm. And if that information can basically tell us what's going to happen, and we can predict in some very crude and granular way, like how the universe is going to end up and how little balls are going to move across the room, then we feel like we're done, then we got stuck in our folding of ourselves into basically a surface.
Then you're very confused why people are increasing in mental illness these days. You're like, wait, why are people having mental illness? We got planes. We're going to be going to Mars. It's like, yeah, that's the whole point. You don't, make a rocket that way, but don't treat the people that way. And they have their own interpretations, and reality is that is the perspective.
And it even goes further. I basically call this overarching theory, so basically you have two kind of opposing paradigms. One of them is the computational paradigm, in that basically reality is finite. And if you can implement a finite ontology onto a Turing machine and then run it until it halts, and then that will tell you something about somehow some externals move or whatever, right, then that's all you can know. And that's like the whole epistemology. Mm-hmm. The countering epistemology is the mystical paradigm, or you could call it whatever, where basically reality is infinite, and there is really no such thing as something that's determined from an algorithm. There is no algorithmic determination. And so you can have an algorithm that runs on a finite state machine and it halts, but that will not actually tell you anything about the infinite ground of all reality. Mm-hmm. And that's interesting, because it also it reinforces this dichotomy, which is fundamental to my theory about internal and external. And so if we go back a second ago, how I was talking about, we have the micro, the mesio, and the macro level, in the sense that, well, you can kind of assume that you're a container, or you're a container within containers. And if I'm and this is my container, let's just assume this is my container, then that's out, and something inside here is in, or whatever. And then that gives rise to the possibility of agency, and that whatever this container is on the surface can make certain decisions that will affect the outside and the inside. But then you can also extend that up. Well, what if I'm also a community, and the community contains me, but I still retain my agency, but now I have communion within this community. I have the ability to make communal decisions, and then that extends all the way up. Like, you could just be like, okay, well, then the earth or the biosphere contains me, or the ecosystem contains these communities, or you can even go further in, like, well, I have these cells that are also part of me that have some agency, and then they kind of work together to collectively create organ systems that kind of have their own ways of doing things, and then those organ systems, like, are contained within me, and then within me, like, it just goes on. You can do this however you want to, really. There's kind of an you kind of have, like, you can kind of think about it like this. It's like, basically, there's an infinite, like, the canvas is infinite in some sense, and you can draw these boundaries, but the way that you draw them, the way that you cut up and slice and dice reality, there's no limit to it.
Right.
And that's what makes it interesting. But in order to even feel like there is something like free will, or like there is like an ability to make decisions or to have agency, you have to fold yourself enough that you would be able to distinguish causal structures that emerge from this cutting up. And once you do that, like, you can select, or you can do whatever, and it might feel like you're selecting within a lower dimensional, like, kind of manifold that is the infinite, like, beyond topologically descriptive universe. Yeah.
That's when you choose to die. That first choice. And I don't know whether it's tied to the choice of becoming a finite being, or whether it's a separate choice. But at some point we made a choice to stop being the unity, right? To fold into something, to have that power to then make a new choice. Now, whether that's technically two choices, one is the infinite self becoming is folding down into a finite self. That was definitely a choice we made. But then, is it a second choice then to choose to be then once you've been folded down? Like, to actually be that finite self? Is that a separate decision? And if it is, then either way, whether it's a separate decision or the same decision, that's the choice to die. At that point, you choose death. Because you can't, that's just how it works. You got to be retracted back into the infinite self at some point.
Yeah, I feel like this is all like so basically, I think it comes down to, like, there's basically a paradox at the heart of reality, and you can talk about this paradox as much as you want, but I think that basically you become the paradox.
Is it infinity or is it zero? Or is it zero or is it infinity? It's like, yeah, we could go about this all day. The beautiful part is the frequency that we do know, 100%, that currently exists, that is neither infinity or zero, but it's incredibly stable. And it's this place where you want to be more with community or you want to be more yourself. They're the same thing. In that middle frequency, and middle's the wrong word, complete wrong word for it. And that's where growth is. It's growth. Right? It's where you folded yourself to get the power that you need, but no more. Right? You're not taking on more folds. But if you do take on more folds, you can always retract back. There's no, like you said, you can slice and dice the canvas infinite times and still be not in infinity or have zero, right?
Yeah, I once defined wisdom as knowing when to stop cutting, which kind of resonates here. But then also another way you could frame this all is in terms of true randomness, because within the computational paradigm, there's no such thing as a deterministic algorithm that can create randomness.
No.
But what if
I was thinking about that the other day when I was engaging with AI. There's a bot on Twitter that I'm engaging with, and I was just thinking about that. It's like, oh, it requires a random number generator, and that is not the same thing as true randomness. So yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. Go ahead though. I'm sure you have a great explanation for this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that basically within this, okay, so basically, I think that it's hard to say like whether actually randomness exists or not. But what I can
Right.
say is that it will appear differently in the computational paradigm and the mystical paradigm. So in the computational paradigm, if reality is finite, then you can fold reality as much as you want, and like that will be like you're grossly aware of like a finite ontology, but there's still an infinity, but it's all round up in these little pockets of randomness. And so there are these little pockets of randomness, but the thing is, when we have
It's
a
like,
transistor,
why did that happen to me? Why
it's
did
like
that thing happen to me? It's like that feels random.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a
So,
different
like, you have, like,
randomness than the computational randomness, right?
yeah, exactly. It's a different randomness. It's like basically you have like that randomness still exists, but like if you have a transistor that can very reliably either be in this state or that state, then there's no room for that randomness to kind of come up and distort things that go all the way up. And so I think, I don't know, like I'm way beyond my depth here, but I'm not like a quantum physicist or anything. And I know there's all this like quantum woo and whatnot, but it really does seem like in order to have some sort of agency that's like what you say in the middle or whatever, it's like it's somewhere in between like the really small and the really large, like there has to be some sort of distortion effect in the learning neurons at a very low level. And so in some sense, I kind of believe, like, kind of on board with like Robert Penrose to some extent, that like basically we have all these neurons, but that's not the surface level story. There's also these quantum computational devices that are sub-neurons that interject somehow like randomness, or if it's not really random, then it's random for all intents and purposes of being an agent like a human.
Right, in the finite realm, exactly.
Yeah.
But
exactly.
in the infinite realm or the infinite realm, it's not randomness. It's explainable, right? But
Yeah,
like you said,
yeah.
Because it's infinite, to give it meaning, it has to be folded down, right? So you can't see you can't see your finite self perfectly at any time, which is why you have to assume that faith, whether it's faith in a religion or not, everything you do is based off of faith, because you don't know 100%. Because if your infinite self does know, it can't do anything about it. To some degree, it's stuck until it gets folded down, and then it can make the choice. But once it gets folded down, that information gets diluted in an infinite amount, and so you can't know for sure. And that's why I really like. I believe this could be apocryphal, but my understanding is one scientist was like, he was in a group of scientists along with Albert Einstein, and was like, he went up and in all seriousness was like, we answer one question and 10 more questions appear. It's like, what are we even doing? And Albert Einstein was like, yeah, that's about right. 10 to 1, yeah. and he was like, then why do you do science? And it's like, because you gotta paint. You gotta paint. Enjoy the ignorance, but try and find as much as you can at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So the infinite self knows exactly what's going on. There is no randomness to some degree, but we don't have access to the pure infinite self because it's stuck. It can't make decisions. So it needs to be folded down. And I like the way that you've been wording it lately, where you're like, oh, it gets folded down or it gets unfolded at various times in your life. I like that. I don't think it's completely necessary, but I like that story. Because I think it could go the other way too, where it's just, you're always folding down, you're never unfolding, but you can never completely fold all the way up, until you're nothing.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I had to kind of grasp this for a while, like with my theory, because you can, on some level, you can find these functions like these cognitive functions, which I'll just do a brief overview with you. It's pretty simple. Basically, you have sensation, which is like basically the farthest external black box of reality. Like there's something all the way out there that's like the universe or whatever, and I can never quite look into this black box, but it has, if I push against it, it'll push back, essentially. And it's like, this is a lot what we usually think of as like objects or whatever. And so you have sensation, and that's matched to the deepest internal point or network of like yourself. Like what is the meaning or purpose of existing? And it's like a centeredness. And so like the centeredness of the universe is in a feedback with like this sensory stuff all the way out here, this sensory structure. And then in between, those are black boxes. And then you have the clear box is the agent. It's like whatever like you say is like that has free will, or that can like make decisions or exist within a can be contained or whatever. Like that's the clear box in between these. But then you can also add two other boxes in between that are opaque boxes that you can kind of see through, but not really. And so like externally, this will be thought. And so you'll have like algorithms, or basically you could have like formal systems, or it's even just like axioms or assumptions or whatever that will be, you can kind of see through and you can kind of get an idea, but it also distorts what is the actual true black box of sensory reality. And so you have this opaque box, and then you have the clear line. It's like always moving. That is the self. And then internally, you also have another opaque box, and that's like feeling. So feeling and thinking are two sides of the same coin. Sensation and intuition are two sides of the same coin. Right. But if you define like, then you can define functions, like one-way functions, like a one-way function from that clear self out to the external structure, that would be extroverted sensation. And you can do the same thing with all the other functions. Like if they're going internal towards the source of reality, they're introverted. If they're going externally, then they're extroverted. And then from there, you have like these functions. But I think what you're basically getting at is like a problem that I had is like, if these functions were actually inversions of each other, like if I pushed out all the way to sensory reality and then I could take that back, then that would be like taking back something that was you, like that would be taking back part of your being. And so in some sense, you never really do that. In some sense, you can kind of do that in a sense that you can kind of, there is like some reversibility, but it's not completely reversible. And this is where you get into entropy and statistical mechanics. Like if we actually take statistical mechanics seriously for a second, and you have like these neurons that wire and do certain things together or whatever, there's no way you can actually unwire that. Like this is a system that is going to be accumulating like mistakes over time, essentially. But then you can
try and divert it, but you can't all of a sudden just unclip it.
Yeah, exactly. You're always traveling through time. That's like one of my major fundamental assumptions. And so if you're traveling through time, then entropically you can lose things. That is, if I define a system and have it have a certain state, and then I fast forward that into the future, then entropically I'm going to lose certain things in the sense that in the future I'm not going to be able to figure out where I started. And then what you can do is you can make this counter like to that, in that there's something called entropy with an I. And this is internal entropy. And this is the kind of a countering force in which as time goes on, you can gain things. And so in some sense, yes, you're always losing things, but you can also have this sense of gaining things. And these two work together as like like two sides of the same epistemological coin that has no ontology. There is no absolute starting or ending points. There is no, I started with this thing, or I ended with this thing. Like the things have to come in there somehow from something else, right? And then from there, like it would seem that like as like a very bigger picture, like as time goes on, you can approach that what would be the causal structure of reality by folding yourself a bunch. And as you fold yourself a bunch, you get an idea of like persistent causal graphs that emerge from time. But at the same time, you lose track of the correlations between specifics. And so like you'll become more disillusioned or confused about very particular things and how they would relate to that absolute causal graph. And this is kind of what I think Einstein meant, is that as you know more, as you fold yourself in ways that produces persistent causal graphs, the actual nodes of these graphs can be very flexible. It's really, you can approach the same kind of causal structure from many different graphs. And so it just like, as that it's a combinatorial explosion of the number of ways in which you can think about reality, essentially the number of things you can start or end with. But yeah.
No, yeah, that's great. I mean, I've said it several times already, but all stories meet at the unity of reality. And I mean that literally. A great example of this was, I was talking to two guys, just barely met them, and we were talking, and then all of a sudden they were like, they brought up some concept, some like movie or something, and then one of them was like, the movie was made in 1911, and the other guy was like, no, it was made in 1908. I was like, well, there's a 3-year difference there, you know? That's big enough for it to be like, oh, those shouldn't add up as the same story. We look up on the Wikipedia and it says it was released in this country in 1908 and released in this country in 1911, and it's just like, you're both right. Didn't think you'd be both right, but you're both right. And they were still wanting to fight about it. It's like, you guys were both right. Isn't that cool? I forget stuff like that all the time, you know?
Yeah.
But it was just like, wow, yeah, stories really do meet up. And it's almost like our perception is what creates a particular, you know, gives power to a particular story, right? And like you said, they're like inverted from each other. So we have a particular perception. So the story is and the most powerful story is the one that uses our perception to unify us again with reality. And they appear simultaneously. You can't have one without the other. You can't like a story that doesn't speak to something real, you know, and I mean the interdimensional real, right? So that's beautiful. What was the other point I was wanting to make? I'm always wanting to make points and then I forget them. Oh yeah, the other point I wanted to make is that you always find people, and by always find people, I mean nearly everyone, if not everyone, I'm going to say everyone. Everyone at some point says, you know what, I wish I would have just made a choice in that moment, right? There was a possibility I was going to fail or I was going to make a bad choice, and I should have just made a choice, you know? That some of the happiest people are the ones that have made a lot of mistakes in their lives, but they did it. They didn't sit on it, they just did it, right? Because you can always divert those folds, that flow. You can divert the flow into something else. You can always do that. But when you just stop the flow, like, what are you doing? Like I said, you're a rock dropping to the bottom of the ocean. You're still going to be pushed in a direction. The flow is always there. You can never negate it. But at least try to divert it, not just be like, no, I'm going to try and stop this ocean, and you're just a pebble. It's like, that's not going to work. And by you're just a pebble, I mean your finite self is the pebble to your infinite self's ocean. So to some degree, you're just fighting with yourself.
So like, yeah, that definitely resonates in that. Yeah, so basically, yeah, it's like basically you can't have absolute reversibility, but you can always divert. And if you are the river that's always flowing through time, then yeah, you're not going to be able to go back and figure out. You're not going to be able to change priors.
But the flow is going to pull you back to the mainstream.
Yeah, the mainstream.
So if you have a rock in the river, Yeah, and you put that rock, you are the rock. Yeah, the water's going to flow this way, and to some degree you're both the rock and the water, right? The water's going to flow this way, but then it's going to flow back. So you're like, I wanted you to flow this way, water, and it's like, you got to know it's just going to flow back the way it was. You know, the flow there. So what is that called? I forget what that's called, but kind of the lines that one can draw to kind of show that process of how the water gets sucked back into the position it already was, right? You put a rock in the water and there's a line and then it gets pushed out. So we keep trying to push the water out thinking that's it. We can just push water out all day long, just keep pushing it out, not realizing that when you push something out, you know, you create a fold. You can't just fold the one edge, right? When you fold the thing, right? You gotta fold. You gotta fold the start and the beginning, right? It's like, I'm gonna create this edge. I just want this edge. But what about these two here, right? The beginning and the start are folded together. You can't make the fold otherwise, right? And so we keep wanting to push the river to the side, you know.
And I think that's basically, okay, all of that basically narrows down to, like, I think you can create these Bayesian machines. And these Bayesian machines, they have some, like, past priors, and then you do some stuff, and then you have, like, likely futures. And, like, if you're trapped in that paradigm, then you'll have this function, and you'll always kind of assume that it is some, like, reversibility to the function. Like,
Right.
if you have these these futures or whatever, that will hint upon what our priors were or something like that. When in reality, I think that you can kind of alternate between that, which is more of like a computational paradigm, to the mystical paradigm, in which synchronicity becomes more important. And that in order to find your way back to, like, the river, or to, like, the average of, like, yourself across time or whatever, you can kind of look at where things don't quite make sense, where the edges of the causal graph don't quite make sense, but they align in a way that was just extremely improbable if you're looking at it from the Bayesian machine perspective.
Exactly.
But you follow these improbabilities, and it leads you back to whatever you're doing, whatever you're becoming, in a way that you feel is authentic to whatever containers you set for yourself.
But to some degree, you can't control it. So your intuition is just pushing you in a particular direction, and you're like, dang it, I don't want to go that way. I wanted to go this way. And it's just like, too bad. And that's why, to some degree, I think the deeper you go, the more that cause and effect actually is helpful. Because if you just make a decision and you expect the effect to come to be a particular thing and come within a particular time frame, you're just going to be wrong. But if you're in the mode of sitting and waiting for the effect, then you can start just operating off of cause and effect, because you're willing to create something and then wait for all the effects of it, right? It's like doing a trial, medical trial, and if you're willing to wait thousands of years and get as much data as you possibly can, well, then you can start relying more on cause and effect. But if you're only going to sit around for a couple of years and you're only going to analyze for a particular, a few data points, you don't care about the mental health of someone, or you don't care about their spirituality, right? And you don't care about the long-term effects, then it's cause and effect isn't as helpful of a way to look at things. And so that's why I like to remind people that mountains are really, really slow waves. Because you look at cause and effect at a long enough time frame, and then you start realizing, okay, yeah, mountains are waves. And
they change, they erode, they rise from volcanoes and grifts in the ocean that lead to these things that form up. And actually, it's really interesting. The older your world is, the more smoother it's going to be.
Uh-huh.
And the younger it is, the more rough it's going to be, roughly speaking.
The more you've got a crest, right? Because the wave at the beginning is kind of smooth, and then it crests up, and then it rounds off again, and then just comes through. So it's very similar process, you know?
Yeah.
And so if you're willing to look slower and slower, that is, you're looking at longer and longer time frames, then the better you can make choices, you know? And the more that you can know that you are unifying the unconscious and the conscious, that your finite and your infinite selves are working a little bit better, because they can never work perfectly together, and that's the whole point.
Yeah, and this all ties back into my theory in that introverted intuition, that is like pushing a point all the way into your deep self, that is, it's predictive of likely futures, and so is introverted feeling. But then you have the opposites, which are extroverted intuition, extroverted feeling, which are testing things out. It's like creating diversions in the river, and that's good too. I mean, that's your playful childhood nature. That's how you get things moving. That's how you get an idea of what folds are likely going to unfold in the future, but also like an idea of like what it is that you are. Like if you were just a river and you just went on forever, whatever, you would be true to your nature and whatever the entire time, but you would never have an idea to express yourself. You wouldn't actually be able to.
You wouldn't learn anything.
Yourself, to other beings, which is interesting. And then you have like, that's like the internal world of intuition and feelings, and then those are mirrored into the external world of sensations and thoughts. Right. And these just like coalesce with each other. And the whole idea of the type model isn't to just be more conformist to what you think you are, and like basically, oh well, I talked to all these other people and they said I was like this, and so I'm just going to stay like this, or whatever. It's kind of to become engaged with and curious about other ways of being, and you can explore and experiment and whatnot with like other ways in which you could be, and eventually you're just going to become probably something that was like averaged or whatever. But then this averaging itself can become disillusioned, in the sense that there is really no way to average. Like, I mean, if you can average, then that kind of implies you have a homogeneous data set in which to draw from, like a static graph. But like I said, time becomes before, and it opens up spaces for these graphs. And so eventually you'll have a lot of these different kinds of graphs that you can draw from. But being able to integrate them all in a way can be satisfying.
Yeah, so ultimately you embracing unity is embracing the specifics of your separation. And that's what's really interesting, is that the more unified you become with reality, the more you accept who you are and the function that you place, that the function that you play in society, in a larger community, in everything. And that's what's really beautiful. Because if you try and lie about who you are, you're not gonna be very unified, and you're not gonna be very happy. So there are inflexible elements to one's identity that like you and I, there's kind of no point in us being extremely extroverted, just being extremely extroverted and, feeling all the time and, being go-getters that are motivational speakers. So it doesn't make sense. And attempting to do that isn't helpful, And we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time, but it's like that's ultimately that middle area, right? That's the middle area of growth, right, is accepting that there are finite elements to who you are, and they're inflexible. They really are. But that doesn't mean you can't play within that space, right? And I think that's
And
the part.
It doesn't mean that whatever your idea of that space is static. So
Right.
like there's always a possibility to go outside that space, and that's
Absolutely.
important. But at the same time, there's going to be these kind of Markovian blankets that like cloud our reality of like what is external and what is internal. And over time, we can get an idea of these boundaries, but we should never treat them as if they're absolute.
Absolutely. Absolutely, don't treat them like absolute.
Absolutely not.
I think we talked about a lot of awesome things here. Daylen, thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely time, and I hope that we can we'll talk soon, and I hope you have some good food today and have some good water and breathe some good air, and that you have a good day.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for a walk. I always like to go for walks after I've had social interaction for some reason. But
you gotta recharge.
Anyway, take care.
Thank you so much.